Hello, everybody, and it's great to see you again at our Gatty lectures of the academic year 2021. It is our third Gatty lecture, but it's actually our first Gatty lecture during the daytime. And we have it because we have our wonderful speaker today, who is actually the member of our own Cornell CIV grad community here, Darin self. My name is Anna Kasheva. I'm a PhD student at Cornell at Asian Studies. And because the question was, what is my background? So my background is Laos, and I'm studying visual culture of Laos and how visual culture helps you understand the modernity of Laos constructed at the intersections of capitalism, communism, and Buddhism during the Cold War study. I also have a wonderful co-host, Kara Goose, who will be joining us a little bit later, but she will be here with us for the Q&A session. I'm pretty sure that most of you are familiar with the format of our talk today. It will be 45 minutes presentation, and after that, we will be able to pick up your questions to the speaker. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A tab, not the chat tab. And we will be picking up these questions and giving them to Darin, and Darin will be clarifying on your questions. So, and without spending any more time on the technicalities and formalities, let me start introducing our speaker for today, Darin self. Who is, as I said, our wonderful member of the grad community here at Cornell. Darin received his BA in Political Science and Masters of Public Policy, the Brigham Young University, where he was mentored by Joel Selby, and where he became interested in Southeast Asian politics. After completing Master in Public Policy, Darin worked at the College of William and Mary before joining for his PhD here at Cornell. At Cornell, Darin works on Southeast Asia and Latin America under the supervision of Tom Pipinski, Ken Roberts, Rachel Riddle, and Nick van der Wal. His research focuses on political development in authoritarian regimes and new democracies. So in today's talk, titled Binding Contestations, How Party-Military Relations Influence Democratization and Indonesia and Paraguay. Darin will be speaking of the following. From taking direct control of politics to setting conditions on democratization or to yielding entirely to civilians, there is a substantial variation in how militaries behave during regime transitions. Sorry. Darin argues that the extent to which military sets parliaments on electoral and political institutions during a regime transition, what he calls bounded democratization, is a function of military's confidence that the parties will protect the military corporate interests following the regime transition. Using a comparative historical analysis of Indonesia and Paraguay, and with quantitative analysis using an original data set, Darin argues that military involvements in these countries are generalizable. And so without further ado, let me hand over to Darin for his wonderful talk.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. Just want to make sure everyone can see my screen. Okay. So I'm excited to speak today. As Anna mentioned, I am a PhD here at Cornell. And for the past 4 or 5 years, I've attended a lot of these Gatty lectures, hoping one day that I would get to stand up in the Cahan Center to present my own talk, but instead I get the pleasure of doing it from my bedroom. So today I'm going to be presenting work for my dissertation titled Binding Contestation, How Party-Military Relations Influence Democratization. And in the title for the talk, I mentioned there's a comparison between Indonesia and Paraguay because I want to use the example of Indonesia and Paraguay, but really focus on Indonesia specifically to show what lessons we can learn from the authoritarian period in Indonesia and what we can learn about democratization, both in Southeast Asia and throughout the world. But to begin my talk, I'm actually going to just give two brief anecdotes that shows different ways that a military can respond to the prospect of democratization that illustrates much of the historical variation of military transitions in the world. So, let me turn on my pointer here. So, okay, so in Ghana, about 10 years after the military took power there, Jerry Rawlings and the military managed a tight transition to democracy by appointing these special councils. And these councils in turn recommended constitutional provisions for the military and Rawlings' approval. And before the first democratic elections in Ghana, Rawlings imposed significant barriers of entry to opposition parties to ensure that his party, which had been built off of the junta, would win. But unlike in Ghana, there are other cases where the military doesn't involve itself so much in the transition. So for example, the Greek military just stepped down from power and turned things over to a conservative ND party after the ND party won a decisive victory in 1974 there in Greece. So there are lots of these different cases I could point to show different ways that how the military either curtails or supports democratization. And this variation led me to form two basic but really important research questions. The first is, why do some militaries support democratization? And second, why do some militaries put limits on democracy? So I'm going to argue here that it's critical to account for the military in the context of democratization because the military poses an ever-present threat to civilian rule due to its control of coercive force. And because it controls force, it can unilaterally undermine democracy. But if we look throughout the world, the military's control of force isn't always a problem. Instead, it becomes a pronounced problem when there's tension between militaries and political parties. So for example, the Chilean military had a hostile relationship with leftists and Allende before removing them from power in a coup. And if we look at Thailand, the military there has contentious relationship with non-conservative parties, which frequently win elections and govern against the military's interests. So under authoritarian rule, the military can just block out the opposition and secure its interests on its own. But usually, militaries prefer to return to the barracks. But one problem about turning power over to civilians is that if there's democratization, democracy introduces uncertainty. There's uncertainty about who's going to win elections. And given who wins elections, there's uncertainty about how they're going to govern. So this presents a challenge for the military. How do they support democratization if a return to civilian rule introduces uncertainty about their interests? In other words, we can think about it in this way. Democracy without political parties is unthinkable. But political parties cannot sustain democracy without the military's consent. So I'm going to propose a new way to help us think about military-led democratic transitions by introducing this concept, which I call bounded democratization. So I'm going to go into more detail later about what exactly I mean by this, but basically what I'm referring to here is militaries can often set restrictions or parameters on political contestation in a way to kind of create these commitments that civilian rule is not going to endanger their interests. Specifically, I'm arguing that the military's confidence is a function of three factors. So the first factor is trust. The military can't be confident in political parties if they don't share the same values or if there's a hostile relationship between the two actors. The second factor is party institutionalization, specifically the institutionalization of an allied party. What I mean by this is that this is a party that's well organized and stable, which signals to the military that the party is going to be there after the democratic transition and likely will defend the military's interests for them. And lastly is party strength. Now, trust and institutionalization are important, but party strength is absolutely critical because if the party is weak, it cannot win power and it cannot defend the military. So as any of these factors increase, the military can be more confident or more certain that a democratic transition is not going to pose a danger to its interests, which we can see here in this diagram. So what I'm basically arguing here is that there are certain conditions that allows the military to get back to the barracks. So it can help us understand why in Indonesia, the military was active during the democratic transition and influenced civilian politicians on many issues of reforms. While in another case in Paraguay, the military just refrained from influencing politicians whatsoever. So I'm going to test my argument by using a mix of methods. So first, I use a small n analysis, specifically comparative historical analysis of Indonesia and Paraguay. And then I use a large n analysis where I use a data set of all military regime failures from 1942 to 2010 in a global sample to see if what I find in my comparison of Indonesia and Paraguay is generalizable. So before I continue, I want to just kind of pause and provide an outline how I'm going to use the remainder of my time. So in the next section, I'm going to place my research within the broader scope of democratization and justify a focus on the military. I'm then going to explain the concept of bounded democratization in greater depth, and then outline my theory and my research design. And then I'm going to provide evidence in support of my theory. And then I'm just going to conclude by showing how this fits within my research agenda, but also kind of some lessons that we can learn for the possibilities of democratization in Southeast Asia. All right, so my research is motivated by an interest in democratization. Now, in comparative politics, democratization is a massive field, and we can divide this field up into a few general themes. So these veins of works focus on democratization, and they use explanations such as elite politics, how the incumbents behave, or how kind of social structures influence democratization. But a key missing component in most of this work is that it overlooks the relationship a military has with political parties. So this previous work uses these traditional concepts of democracy. Now these concepts, instead of looking at kind of how the military relates with the polity, instead focuses on how those in power relates to the government and polity, and it kind of is less well suited for incorporating the military into these transitions. They also use what are called these minimalist procedural concepts of democracy. What we mean by this is that for something to be considered a democracy, it must pass this threshold, such as the presence of free and fair elections, the possibility of alternation in power, and an elected executive. And then lately, we've kind of seen more and more concepts about democracy trying to address all the different ways that democracy can be imperfect, right? So a lot of the earlier work was during the 1990s when everyone was democratizing and everyone was kind of this cheerleader on the sidelines and we're really excited. And today we realize that we probably shouldn't be so optimistic about democracy. Now, one of these concepts is competitive authoritarianism. So this was a concept developed by Steve Levitsky and Luke and Wei. And what they wanted to argue is that some incumbent parties can use their strength during authoritarianism or authoritarian transition to tilt the playing field in their way that prevents full democratization, which we can see here in this table, right? So under a competitive authoritarian regime, the party tilts this playing field to their advantage, and we don't get full democratization. But what this is missing out is that a lot of regime transitions, especially in the wake of the Cold War, were instances where these countries were coming out of military rule rather than kind of the civilian party rule that we saw in like Eastern Europe. And so what this is overlooking is that the military can use its power to exclude certain actors from politics as a way to kind of protect itself rather than trying to secure seats of power for itself. So to understand how the military affects democracy, we need to think about democratization differently. So one problem with this previous literature is that it often focuses on the explanation by focusing on how the military affects its own traditional sphere, such as its budget, internal discipline, its hierarchy, what its mission is, and strategies. But what I'm arguing is that instead, we need to actually focus our shift to how the military affects what is the traditional civilian sphere. And what I mean by this is how does the military affect the development of parties, legislatures, and elections? So I'm going to contribute to our understanding of democratization generally by highlighting this party-military relationship and showing that not all militaries behave the same way during potential democratic transitions, not due to like their structure or how they see themselves, but instead how they actually relate to political parties. Okay, so to address how militaries affect democratization in a unique way, I'm developing this new concept which addresses how the military relates to the government or the polity, the citizenry, right? And I call this bounded democratization. Now, I'm centering bounded democratization around the military because the military is different from other key actors that we've traditionally focused on during democratization. And it's different because it controls the tools of coercive force, as I mentioned, but also because its political interests are actually quite distinct, right? So where parties or individuals are interested in winning seats or power, often the military is not having these interests. Instead, it's more political interest centered around its ability to fulfill its mission. And I define bounded democratization as a transition towards a more competitive system wherein the military set parameters on electoral and political institutions and our actors in a way to constrain open contestation and popular sovereignty. So this concept of bounded democratization is different from more traditional concepts of democracy in a few ways. So first, it's very narrowly focused on the military as an actor, rather than looking at kind of generally thinking in incumbents or elites or structures. And second, it's focused on how the military affects procedural democracy, the procedures of how power is exercised, right? I do this because I'm thinking of how the military is worried about how power is exercised. And if this is the case, then we need to think about how the military is going to affect how power is exercised. And lastly, this concept does not need to meet any minimalist threshold of democracy. And I'm avoiding conceptualizing bounded democratization around these minimalist thresholds because it may be possible, that the military acts sufficiently aggressive during democratization or a regime transition that democratization is not achieved, even if it had been a possibility. So what I'm showing is that there are actually multiple ways to get to what we think of as competitive authoritarianism, right? So for over a decade, we've thought of competitive authoritarianism as solely comprising this left half of the 2x2 here, where the regime was structured by civilian incumbents. But what I'm showing is that if we think about competitive authoritarianism within this framework of bounded democracy, we can actually think about the different ways that militaries behave during these regime transitions to constrain the possibility of full democratization, right? And it's important to distinguish these concepts of competitive authoritarianism by the pass out of authoritarian rule, because it demonstrates the different ways that political parties can play a role. So for Levitsky and Way, the presence of a stronger institutionalized party increases the probability that we end up here in this top left corner. But what I'm going to argue is that if there's a strong and institutionalized party, we're actually more likely to end up here in the bottom right with democracy. So the goal of my research is to show how we can end up somewhere between these two quadrants here on the right. And I'm going to explain how the military affects democracy. So the theory that I'm developing is applicable to situations where there was military rule, which then failed, and where there was some possibility of democratization. So when the military faces the prospect of democratization, a key problem for it is its ability to secure its own institutional interests after democratization. And this is a problem for the military because when it steps away from power, it can no longer control the levers of government. So this introduces uncertainty about its interests, right? There's uncertainty about who's going to win power and how they're going to govern. And so the key question is whether the military is going to be confident that there's a commitment that its interests are going to be secure in order for it to return to the barracks and get out of politics. So when when facing the potential of democratic transition, there's basically two ways to reduce uncertainty. The first is that the military can just bind the transition or impose these constraints on civilians, right? But an alternative path for the military is that it can turn towards a reliable partner. And this is where I'm going to focus my discussion on, is what are these conditions that makes a partner reliable, or how can the military actually be confident that a political party is going to be able to defend the military's interests? Now, for this exercise, I'm going to focus specifically on the incumbent party, or the party that's in power during authoritarian rule. I do this to show how the theoretical mechanisms function. And I'm also doing this because they're easily identified, and more often than not, they're actually allied with the military. So there's already a degree of trust between the two actors. But I can relax this component of my theory to think about and demonstrate then how things are going to function if this isn't necessarily the case, right? Sorry. Okay, so there are the three factors that I'm going to focus on in my explanation of what builds a military's confidence. So the first factor is trust. By trust, what I mean is that there's an expectation that this partner is going to act on the military's behalf. When militaries face this prospect of democratization, they're going to consider whether the parties that are going to come to power are going to govern on behalf of the military. Now, militaries are going to be more likely to trust parties that share similar interests, if they have some shared vision of the national project, or if there's a shared ethnic identity or ideology. Now, while these might be important, overlapping interests or identities are not really enough to produce trust. Trust is built through repeated interaction and via strong relationships. So in interviews that I conducted with generals, they often spoke about how they trusted the politicians of these different parties because they had worked side by side during authoritarian rule, and they knew them very well. And the generals were kind of certain of these politicians' worldview. So in the case of the incumbent party, there's usually a high degree of trust between the military and the party because they usually come to power through some shared struggle and then rule side by side. But this isn't necessarily always the case. For example, in Egypt, Mubarak's NDP party was highly personalized, and Mubarak was grooming his son to take power. So this led to a low degree of trust between the military and the party. In other instances, there's just no trusted party for the military in the system. A good example of this is in Argentina in the 1980s, where the military was ready to democratize, but they kind of looked at the party system. There was no one that was allied with the military, so they kind of picked a party that they thought would at least be tolerable to them, and they negotiated the terms of democratization with them. Okay, so moving to the next component, I'm going to focus on party institutionalization. So party institutionalization is when a political party has a stable organization, right? It's there over time and doesn't just come and go. It needs to be autonomous from other actors. It needs to be able to govern itself and make decisions. It needs to have routinized procedures of internal governments, right? So this means committees and rules that govern internal conflict within the party. And lastly, it also needs the capacity for national level mobilization. So party institutionalization helps the military be more confident because when officers look at an institutionalized party, they actually see an organization that's not too different from the military, and this boosts their confidence. Another way that this helps their confidence is that these institutionalized parties are more likely to survive a transition and be there after democratization to defend the military. So the military doesn't have to worry that this party is just going to die during the transition and go away. Instead, it can be quite confident that there's going to be a party there to defend it. So while trust and institutionalization are important, party strength is absolutely critical. What I mean by party strength is the capacity of the political party to win both national and subnational office, as well as govern autonomously from the military, right? It doesn't need the military's help in governing. The party can demonstrate its strength to the military by dominating elections during authoritarian rule, right? Which is what we see often in the case of like Paraguay or even Indonesia to a certain extent. But if there aren't elections, the party can demonstrate its strength right, controlling state and civil society. Right. So up to this point, I've been framing things around the military's confidence in terms of uncertainty, but it might actually be the case that there's little uncertainty because the military is well aware of the party's strength, right? So what it's going to do, even in this situation, is it's going to evaluate the strength and institutionalization of parties that it trusts and evaluate this relative to any opposition parties. And if it kind of concludes that these opposition parties are just too strong, it's going to behave as if there was uncertainty because it cannot be confident that its allied parties are going to be able to win power and defend it. So each of these three mechanisms that I've outlined are antecedent conditions. And what I mean by this is that these conditions are present before military rule fails. And when military rule fails, the military can then look at these factors and evaluate the party system, and this is going to affect its confidence in democratization, right? So when trust is high, when party institutionalization and strength are high, the military is going to be confident in the party system, and there will be unbounded democratization. Now, if these factors are low, we're more likely to see bounded democratization. So what does this look like in practice? Well, in unbounded democratization, civilians set the terms of the transition, and that's pretty much it. The military just kind of steps back and let things happen. Now, bounded democratization can look differently depending on the case. Most often what we see is the military using formal political powers to constrain civilians. A lot of times we actually see the military banning specific parties or candidates, right? So in Indonesia, the Communist Party is banned, right? It's just unquestionable for the military that that party cannot be part of the party system. Often what we see is that militaries create or control transitional institutions, right? So in the example of Ghana that I started with, the military there created these transitional councils who kind of came up with these constitutional provisions. And lastly, we see often as well that the militaries just design specific institutions. And then lastly, what's quite frequently seen is that officers, whether active or retired, will run for political office to kind of wrest control of politics and defend the military. So to test my theory, I used a mix of methods. And I'm using this mix of methods because I'm trying to explain variation with a specific where I cannot manipulate these variables, right? So for the small n analysis, I'm using comparative historical analysis. I'm doing this because I want to focus on the relationship between the military and its party and how this affects political development. Now, by using comparative historical analysis, I can take a case where party institutionalization and strength are high and compare this to a counterfactual case to where these are low and observe the differences in the military's behavior. In addition to the comparative historical analysis, I do a large N analysis, which I'm going to go into more detail after I do the comparative historical analysis for you. Now, to collect data for the comparative historical analysis, I spent over a year in the field. As part of my fieldwork, I conducted over 33 hours of semi-structured elite interviews. So this was with former presidents, vice presidents, generals, and party leaders. I supplemented this data with data from national, party, and military archives. So getting into national archives was pretty straightforward. In Indonesia, I had to jump through a bunch of hoops, but once I got my visa, it was pretty straightforward. But accessing party and military archives is a much more significant challenge. For example, in Paraguay, I worked with the Ministry of Defense there over time, trying to get into their archives, but I just kept on hitting these bureaucratic roadblocks. So someone gave me this name of this officer who worked in the military headquarters, which is separate from the Ministry of Defense. And so I just walked up to the guard gate one day and said that I was there to see this officer. And luckily they let me in. And I then spent several days in this officer's office building this rapport. And eventually he gave me access to these archives. And so there was similar work that I had to do, like in Indonesia as well, trying to build a rapport with elites who then could grant access to these unique archives. And then lastly, I also use secondary resources, both in the local language and in English. Now, to perform the comparative historical analysis, I'm comparing the cases of Indonesia and Paraguay. Now here I'm using a case selection method where both Indonesia and Paraguay represent part of the full distribution of post-military rule, but in a way that I can really narrow down on how the party matters, because both of them had an incumbent party. So I'm going to show how the differences in their party characteristics is tied to the differences in the military's behavior in these two cases. By comparing Indonesia and Paraguay, I can also perform Mills methods of difference, or a most similar case selection method here, where Indonesia and Paraguay are similar on several theoretically relevant factors, right? So if we look down here, both cases democratized. They kind of moved to free and fair elections. Both had a regime type, which we call a triple threat regime. What this means is there was a former military general as the head of the regime who ruled in a coalition with a military and a party. And then both these regimes survived for a similar amount of time over a similar time period, and both had fairly well institutionalized militaries. But where the key difference is actually on the characteristics of the parties, on the institutionalization and strength of the incumbent parties. So I'm going to actually, by selecting these two cases, I'm actually holding trust constant. So both parties, in both cases, were trusted by the military, but the military's confidence is going to be, as I'm going to demonstrate, affected by the institutionalization and strength of these parties. So I'm going to start with the case of Indonesia, right? So luckily to this group of people, I don't have to justify researching Indonesia. I think we all know that it's an important case, important to look at and understand this country, right? For those of you who may be a little less familiar with their history, so Indonesia gained independence from the Dutch in 1949 after 4 years of very violent revolution. And during this time and right before the revolution, the foundation of the military was built on this set of nationalist officers. And these officers had a very low degree of trust with political parties, especially leftist and Islamist parties. And that was because these parties and organizations engaged in armed rebellion during the revolution against the military. And then for the first 2 decades of independence, these groups were constantly fighting with the military. And it ultimately culminated in an abortive coup by the communists in 1965. Now, before the coup, about a year before the coup, the military actually formed a quasi-party known as Sekber Golkar. And they did this because the president at the time, Sukarno, had grown dissatisfied with political parties, and he wanted to shift towards this corporatist system. And so the military, what they did is they gathered all these nationalist-oriented corporatist groups, and they threw them together in this organization known as Sekber Golkar. But it was poorly institutionalized. There were scores and scores of these groups. They were all under different leadership committees, fighting with each other, and also most of these committees were controlled by military officers. So there wasn't much independence for the organization to develop itself. Now, after the military takes power, they began preparing for elections, and they changed Sekber Golkar into an electoral arm of the regime known as Golkar. And over the 30 years of power, they really invested and developed Golkar. And so eventually Golkar becomes this nationally, this broad structure found in most of in Indonesia, with routinized procedures to govern internal matters. But ultimately, Golkar has a couple key weaknesses. So first, it lacked autonomy from the military. And in addition to lacking autonomy from the military, it was electorally untested. So because the regime guaranteed electoral victories for Golkar, no one really knew Golkar's real capacity to compete in elections once authoritarian rule ended. And lastly, because Golkar was built from the top down, it had weak social linkages, right? While some people were really valued the party, there wasn't this strong kind of commitment or identity with being with Golkar, right? And so it's kind of striking to see these weaknesses, especially when we compare Golkar to the ruling party in Paraguay, known as the Colorado Party. So the Colorado Party there was established in the 1880s by oligarchs, and it developed autonomously from other organizations. After a couple of decades in the 1920s, party activists really began developing the party at the local level. So they developed what are called seccionales. So if you remember that picture from the first slide, that's a seccional. Now these seccionales aren't just party offices, they're party community centers. And these community centers hold literal parties for the party, weddings, barbecues, soccer matches, you name it. And they tie the party deeply to society, and they're in every single neighborhood. In addition to having these deep social roots, the Colorado Party became institutionalized at the national level after the Chaco War with Bolivia. What happened there is the ruling party at that time, the Liberal Party, was very unpopular and wanted to ban all opposition parties. And so this served as the catalyst for the Colorado Party to create a national organization that would tie all these seccionales together and unite the different elites within the party. So they created national committees and rules and commitments to this national organization. And eventually, the party would come to power 10 years after that by winning a civil war. And through this conflict, there became this crystallized identity of being a Colorado. And even today, when you go into Paraguay, people talk about being Colorado, much as in the United States, you see people identify as being a Republican or a Democrat, right? Colorados do not marry liberals in Paraguay. They only marry Colorados. So there's kind of this strong party identity there. Okay, so now that I've laid out these antecedent conditions, what should we expect to happen? Well, in Indonesia, we should expect a low degree of confidence between the military and the party. And this means that we're going to see the military be more active in the transition. We're going to see it use formal institutions or seek specific formal institutions. And likely we're going to be seeing it participating in elections. In Paraguay, on the other hand, because of the strength and institutionalization of the Colorado Party, we should expect a high degree of confidence from the military and the party, which means that we should just see the military return to the barracks and defer to the party during democratization. Okay, so returning to the case of Indonesia, the transition there begins when there's internal calls for Suharto's resignation. This started in the legislature when the leadership there called for Suharto to resign or to be impeached. After this call, the commander of the military at the time, Wiranto, backed Suharto. He went so far as to claim the actions of the legislature to be illegitimate. He kept the military active at this time on the streets, and it really demonstrates that he lacked confidence in the party to manage things on its own. Now, eventually, things got the internal pressure for Suharto's resignation became so great that Suharto did decide to resign. But before he stepped down, he actually granted Wiranto the power to control the transition unilaterally by forming a military council. And this also demonstrates Suharto, who's ultimately the commander of the military as being president, he lacked confidence in Golkar as well. Now, Wiranto knew that if he took control of the transition, he would potentially damage the military's reputation. So instead, what he did is he backed a transition to a civilian president, B.J. Habibie, who was a member of Golkar, but then the military remained politically active at this time. As a former prominent general explained to me, he explained that the military was active at this time because the parties did not provide leadership. And so the military kind of had to take things into its own hands, right? And so what did this look like? Well, for starters, the military with Golkar rushed through a lot of reforms before the 1999 election, where there would be free and fair elections and the military would potentially see Golkar in itself lose power. One of these reforms that it rushed through was about decentralization. So it's really important to understand that for the Indonesian military, the unified territory of Indonesia is central to its identity, and that it does not want to risk Indonesia breaking apart. And that robust decentralization could potentially do this. So what the military did is it put forth a very moderate package of decentralization where local offices, political offices like mayors and governors and legislatures would be elected, but that was it. There wasn't much power given to these local areas away from the state, especially on security matters. In addition to kind of this watered down reform, the military ensured that the reform would be implemented slowly over several years so that any opposition could not just sweep into power. In addition to rushing these reforms before the 1990 elections, a lot of generals retired and entered the executive or the legislature, and they used their power within these major institutions to prevent specific reforms from being implemented, right? So after the 1999 election, the Islamist leader Gus Dur becomes president, and military officials in his cabinet and in the legislature block him from implementing more robust reforms to the military. And so they're ensuring that these political actors can't go out at alone. And eventually, the military helped remove Gus Dur from power. Now, at that time, the military held seats in the legislature, and it used its votes or its seats to vote in favor unanimously in favor of removing Gus Dur from power. And at the same time, it mobilized forces on the streets of Jakarta to protect the impeachment proceedings and as a show of force against Gus Dur. So here we can see the military is actively restraining the potential development of any new institutions that would be straying too far from the military's preferences. Now, after Gus Dur is removed, a more nationalist-oriented person is put into the presidency, and things continue on in the reform process towards the 2004 elections. And in the 2004 elections, the president of Indonesia will be directly elected for the first time. And in this election, two prominent generals run for office: Wiranto, who I've already mentioned, and Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, both prominent, well-known generals. And Yudhoyono wins this election. And at the same time, Golkar, which had lost its position as the largest party in power in the 1990 election, regains its position as the largest party in 2004. So with Yudhoyono in power, which we can clearly see the military loved having him in power, and with Golkar in power, the military could finally resign its formal political powers, knowing that these pro-military nationalists were in power and that there was not any immediate danger to the military's interests. So given that this is bounded democratization in Indonesia, let's take a look at unbounded democratization in Paraguay. So the transition there begins with a coup to remove Alfredo Stroessner, who had been president for 35 years. This was done by a friend of his, actually his son-in-law, Andrés Rodriguez, who was the commander of the Army's 1st Division. And after the coup, the party installed Andrés Rodriguez into the presidency, but because he was an interim president, he had to hold elections. And these elections were free and fair, and the Colorado Party dominated these elections. So after these elections, the party decides to shift towards democratization, and it wants to write a new constitution. It wants to do this in part to prevent Rodriguez from becoming another Alfredo Stroessner, right? So they the party specifically embeds rules that the president cannot be reelected. But and then it's important to note here that they held an election to select the Constitutional Assembly, which the Colorado Party dominated. And in this Constitutional Assembly, the military had a legal formal role that was granted to it. But in several interviews with people who participated in the writing of the Constitution, they said that the military just did not participate. It completely deferred towards civilians. As Diego Abente Brun, one of the members of the opposition, who was in the Constitutional Assembly, he said the strength of the Colorado Party was the insurance for the armed forces to feel secure. Jose Moreno Ruffinelli, who wrote the Constitution, he was a leader in the Colorado Party at the time. He said the armed forces were ready to democratize. They had complete confidence in civilian leadership. And eventually, Andrés Rodriguez, pictured here, gave a speech when the new constitution was ratified, and he spoke about how the military could be confident in this transition because they were safe in the Colorado Party's hands. And he said, "Misión cumplida." And to the best of my knowledge, he did not give the speech on an aircraft carrier in front of a massive banner. And so to end, I'm just going to kind of summarize this comparison, right? So in Paraguay, the military had a high degree of confidence in the party because the party was exceptionally strong, electorally strong, it had deep roots in society, and it was well institutionalized. In Indonesia, on the other hand, we see the military lack confidence in Golkar, and it uses its political powers to bind the transition so that democratization is on the military's terms. Now, I'm going to turn towards the large end analysis here, and the goal of this large end analysis is take these lessons that we've learned from Indonesia and Paraguay and see if they apply generally. And to begin this analysis, what I want to outline here is that I created a sample of over 525 military regimes. Now, these cases are drawn from 4 data sets. Each of these data sets are widely used in comparative politics, and they code for whether or not authoritarian rule was militarized or not. And then I draw a sample of cases where the regime transition resulted in something more competitive than closed authoritarian rule. And I'm doing this because I want to see how the military affects the development of competitive institutions, or how it can constrain or not constrain civilian actors. To perform this analysis, I create an original measure of bounded democratization. So I code this myself. I start by creating 4 general categories for the different ways that the military can kind of affect politics during a transition. So this focuses on the executive, the legislature, on elections, and then transitional institutions such as a constitutional assembly or council. I then code several indices within each of these categories, and I asked different types of questions. I asked, for example, did the military appoint the executive? Did the military hold seats in the legislature, as we see in Indonesia? Did the military design electoral institutions, or did the military appoint members of this transitional council? And with these 19 indices, I use what's called item response theory, or IRT analysis. And this helps to see the correlation between all these different variables, and it creates this single continuous measure of bounded democratization. With this measure, I then also create a measure of party institutionalization. Here, I'm focusing specifically on the incumbent party. I'm doing this to select on the degree of trust between the military and the party, because I don't have a way to measure whether or not the military trusts the party. And so to measure institutionalization for the incumbent party, I draw from what's called the varieties of democracy and the varieties of party data. Now, what these people do is they create several components, and I draw on 3 specific components: the degree to their ties to social organizations to account for the national mobilization capacity of the party, whether or not the party controls its own nominations, so this gets at autonomy of the party, and lastly, the permanency of local branches, so this gets at whether or not the party is a stable organization. So VDEM and VParty, they create this data by surveying country experts, and so they send these surveys to these country experts, and they ask them several questions about either democracy or parties, and this is an example we can see. Right, so the country experts get this, and they say, to what extent does the party maintain ties to prominent social organizations? And then they rank it, right? And then VDEM takes all this data. They use this Bayesian measurement model to create a continuous measure of this factor. And then I use factor analysis to create a continuous measure of party institutionalization. And then I do the same thing for party strength. So again, selecting on the incumbent party, I then select the vote share of the party, the seat share of the party, and then the degree to which a single party controls subnational office. And this helps me measure the strength of this party. I then use regression analysis to see if there's covariation between party institutionalization strength and bounded democratization. And in these regressions, what I do is I account for several alternative explanations that are prominent in comparative politics. This includes the distributional consequences thesis. Now, this is an argument that income and land inequality really matter for democratization. If elites fear redistribution, if there's democracy, they're going to prevent democracy, basically. I also account for how wealthy the country is, which is common to think about in democracy. Also, the amount of resource wealth, whether this is oil or minerals. I account for the level of education in the population, what region of the world it's in, the degree of its urban population, and then the amount of military spending to get at kind of the coercive capacity of the military to prevent democratization. And so what I do is I create two models. Now, this data is pulled from the Get Us Right in France data set. This dataset's appropriate to use here because they code military rule if there's corporate military rules, or it has to be organized and coming from the military as an institution. And what we can see here is the results for it. In the black model, this is kind of my base model, which includes party institutionalization and a bunch of the other alternative explanations. And then I add in that there is some overlapping of the confidence intervals here, but it's directionally consistent, and the confidence interval, grew there largely because I lost a few cases from the 50s where we don't have a good measure of income and land inequality. I then switch out party institutionalization for party strength, and we kind of find the same thing here. As party strength increases, we see less bounded democratization. So what should we take from these regression models? The basic premise here is that what I found by looking at Indonesia and Paraguay is generalizable in a global sample. So the lessons that we're learning from Indonesia, how the military behaved, is applicable elsewhere. It can help us explain why in other cases, such as Sudan today, the military is active during potential democratic transitions. Now, to conclude, I just want to highlight some of the contributions of my work. So I'm providing this new analytical lens to help us understand democratization. Specifically, I'm honing in on the relationship between the party and the military, where previous explanations of the military's behavior focus on kind of the structure of the military or how the military sees itself. What I'm instead showing is that the military actually evaluates the political and party system that it's embedded in, and then its behavior changes based off of the degree of confidence it has in civilian parties. So I just mentioned Sudan, so I think this is a good example to help explain the military's behavior there. After massive protests, the military removed Omar Bashir from power, but then the military stayed in power, and it only agreed to a transitional council after there was extreme international pressure. And on this council, it holds 50% of the seats. And then what the military is doing here is because it lacks a trusted partner in the party system that it can be confident in, it has to kind of take things into its own hands. I also am creating this new concept of bounded democratization. This is helping us think about democratization differently. It goes beyond kind of traditional concepts of procedural democracy or democratic quality, and is helping us think about how the military behaves during these transitions. I've also tested my theory using original data. So to conclude, I want us to think about what are the lessons that we can draw on here for democracy in Southeast Asia. So first, we need to focus on procedural democracy. What I'm going to explain here is narrowed down on whether or not there's democratic procedures, right? Free and fair elections, is the legislature and executive elected, right? This does not really help us think about the extent that there's kind of liberal democracy or respect for like free speech and religious rights and stuff like this, right? So that goes beyond kind of the scope of my analysis. And it's applicable to cases where there's post-Praetorian or military rule, right? So I'm going to focus my discussion here specifically on Thailand, Burma, and Indonesia, and what we kind of should expect for the future here. And my main question is democracy safe for the military, right? If we don't see democracy, why not? Or if we see democracy, is it going to continue being safe for the military? So starting with Thailand here, right? So we need to look at the party system in Thailand. For those of you who are familiar with Thailand and probably know more about than me, but what I know about Thailand is there are tons of political parties. It's an extremely fragmented party system, and there's not too many parties that are pro-military that are strong. Right now, the PPP party, Palang Pracharat, I hope I did not butcher that, is currently in the government, but it only holds 24% of the seats, right? And so this creates a danger for the military. The military, if it were just to step back and not influence elections or kind of these democratic procedures, most likely its parties would just be swept out of power. And so what they've done to prevent this is they kind of lean on the scales a little bit, but also they created an upper house or a Senate that is completely appointed by the military, right? So even if like a Thaksin party wins power overwhelmingly in the lower house and takes control there, it can't really do much because the Senate would just block everything that they would do. And this entrenches the military's influence on the legislature because there's no allied party for the military strong enough to kind of balance the scales for it. Right. Now, if we look at Burma, right now the military is still very much in power there. So if we look at in their two houses of their legislature, so the first digit here is the lower house, the second is the upper house. So the military itself gets 25% of the seats, and then it has the USDP, which is a pro-military party, and combined in the lower house, they have 32% of the seats, and in the upper house, they have 30% of the seats. So again, kind of like in Thailand, not much. And the NLD party is the largest party. It's a majority party, right? It holds 51% of the seats in the lower house and 60% of the seats in the upper house. Now, the NLD party is not really anti-military, but the military doesn't fully trust them. But what I'm going to, as I see the Burma case, what's more worrisome for the military is actually the presence of these regional parties and regional conflict, right? So parties that are based on specific regions make up almost 10% of both the upper and lower house. And so what this is showing is that there are nationalist movements within Burma that threaten to kind of break up the state, right? And this is the conflict that the military is engaged in. It wants to maintain a unified Burma, much as the military in Indonesia wants to maintain a unified Indonesia. But there's no party that cuts across all these national identities, right? Like Golkar is competitive in Sulawesi, Jawa, and Sumatra, right? Like in all these islands. And that's not necessarily the case for the NLD or any pro-military party in Burma. And so this makes it harder for the military to be confident in democracy not leading to more problems, right? And so in Indonesia, what do we expect here? Well, if we look at the Indonesia legislature, if we broadly define nationalist parties, so parties that are all kind of hold to Pancasila, right? They hold 70% of the seats, right? And so this shows that the military, while kind of politically active on the margins, right? It's not going to step in and kind of reestablish this new order politics because these nationalist parties are governing in a way that's acceptable to the military. So is this a solvable problem, right? I've identified this problem. Can we solve this specifically in Thailand or Burma, right? I wish I could have a good answer. It's not really a solvable problem. What these militaries need is confidence that there's some conservative or cross-cutting party that can hold enough power to protect the military's interests, and that doesn't exist, right? So in other cases, if we looked at other regions, what we've seen is militaries often just create their own parties and kind of tip the scales. But in Thailand and Burma, what we've seen is they've really entrenched their rule here. Like they're still present. There's not even a minimal idea of or minimal procedures of democracy in these two cases. Now, if there's some hope to create this system where the military can just step away and let civilians completely control things, you would need institutions that kind of ensure or bias the system in favor of pro-military parties. And an example of this is in Chile. The constitution there, the Senate there is extremely biased towards conservative parties. And so leftist parties can't get too much power. And this kind of gave the military confidence to step away from power, and it's still in place today and still functioning exactly how it does. So Chile has this democracy, there are elections. It's not completely representative of the people. Is it better than what we see in Thailand and Burma? I would say yes. But is that satisfying? Is that a satisfying answer, right? Would you prefer that? Or is it kind of, is the question about full democracy or we're just going to keep on fighting and not come to the table here, right? So with that, I just want to say thank you. I appreciate the time that you've dedicated, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Darin. Do you mind stop sharing your screen?
Yep, just give me a second.
And James, can we switch to the, oh, no, we can switch to the gallery ourselves. Darin, thank you so much. This was a fascinating talk. I truly enjoyed it, so thank you. We see that we are actually a little smaller group, but group of most probably familiar faces to you. So what we decided to do, instead of us moderating the Q&A, why wouldn't we just open the floor to everybody? We do have the first question coming to you in the chat. We actually have 2 questions to you in the chat, but I think after you pick that questions, we can just basically invite everybody to raise their hand and ask questions directed to you rather than running through Kara and myself. So the first question to you is from Tom Bruce. And Tom is saying that this is a great talk. Thank you so much. Maybe I can actually invite Tom to do it himself if he's still around. Tom, do you mind?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you. No, thank you very much for this talk. I was really excited to finally start learning about your work. A number of questions, but what really stood out for me, at least, and especially I guess at this stage in my own PhD research, like I'm really curious, like how did you build rapport with these serving and retired members of the Indonesian military? Like, do you have any kind of thoughts, recommendations about how you did research on these kind of topics that can sometimes be sensitive? I've heard work done in Indonesia, for example, on the massacres, and of course, it's very difficult to do, but I'm just really curious, like how you got to know these guys. Thank you.
Yeah, so the first thing is be very careful about your public persona, and make sure that there are no sensitive issues, right? Because they will screen you before you show up. In terms of building a rapport, I would work with APHIS, right? Their office was essential in getting my foot into the door into these elite circles. Because once you get into elite circles, it's actually quite easy to then get the next interview, right? A lot of these people know each other, they have each other's cell phone numbers, right? Like I would be in an interview with someone and be like, yeah, sure, let me just text Akbar Tanjung and you can go talk to him. And that's how it worked, right? And that's kind of how it got with retired generals. So especially the ones with close ties to Golkar were easier to access. There are some generals that are just going to be harder to access, like Wiranto, right? I was going to have an interview with him. It was all set up. And then another general criticized him on national TV and he ghosted me. So, right, like just understand like people like him are quite sensitive about their public persona. They had to screen my questions, right? So there was never going to be any questions about East Timor or kind of how he managed conflict, right? I had to make sure that it was very clear, like I want to understand what you thought the military's mission was during this time. Other people like Agus Wijoyo are very open, right? Like they're very helpful. They're actually, he's pretty much an academic, right? He'll cite Sam Huntington to you and kind of have that type of conversation. But that was because I had developed a relationship with other elites, right? So specifically, I had friends at the University of Indonesia that knew these generals, and they set up these interviews with me, right? Like I was going to have an interview with SBY, but then his wife got cancer at that time, and so, but like he had good friends at University of Indonesia, which opened that door for me. So yeah, you just got to put in the legwork and be prepared that it's going to take some time, right? A lot of them will say like if you contacted them before you go to Indonesia, they're like, yeah, call me when you get here, and you think that it's going to be this quick thing, but it's like 3 months later that you finally get the interview with them. So just start doing like other research and and set it up in a way that if you get the interview, you can just drop everything, hop on a train to another town if you have to, and get the interview.
Thank you, Darin. We also had a question from Samora. Samora, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you so much, Darin. What a great talk. And I really appreciated that you made the comparisons to Thailand and Myanmar. Although I think with Thailand, you're going to want to look deeper historically if you go into it in any further depth, because there's such a difference, pre and post coup in terms of what's going on with parties and how bounded or it just changes so much over the years.
Yeah, Thailand's definitely a difficult case because the behavior of the military actually is so different after a lot of these coups. But there's kind of this common theme of, well, we didn't like democracy, let's try to rewrite the constitution.
Right, and actually it was the Thai case that made me think of my real question, which is the police. Because in certain moments in Thailand, the police play a role, or certain politicians like Thaksin move their way up through the police, and that network. And I guess after watching the debate in the US the other night, and all of the politics that are happening right now around the police, and the increasing discussion of how the militarization of the police is playing out and also playing a role politically, I guess I wonder how your model fits the police in as a factor in terms of this bounded and unbounded, because it's not just the military who have a kind of legitimate way of using, coercive force. Yeah. And that gets deployed, in very particular ways. And I think that at least some here in the US would argue that the police are actually more actively involved in using it against certain categories of citizens, and that there's a way in which that has political consequences. So, just the idea, I just listening to Trump talk about how, what police organizations have endorsed you, Biden, yeah. That whole thing was just so interesting in relation to what you're talking about to me. So I guess that's what I'd love to hear your perspective on, whether or not it's specifically US based, but just what do you do with the police in your model?
Yeah, it's great to have the United States applicable to my research. It's something that when I started, I did not want to be the case. So I'm going to actually start with maybe the US more specifically, and then try to broaden things. So I think what you see in the US is specifically with the police is this push to maintain the racial hierarchy, right? And so if there's this threat to that power structure, we're going to see the police become more aggressive. And so we were seeing them more willing, I guess for decades they've done this, but right now it's really pernicious, just very willing to violate democratic norms. But I think a lot of this is actually because there's very weak institutional control of the military, of the police in the United States. Sheriffs are directly elected, right? Like imagine if a general, like the Panglima, the head of Indonesia's TNI, if they were directly elected, it would just be absurd, right? And so the structure of police in the United States creates significant autonomy from civilian oversight. You do get this in other places as well. Now it's much harder for the police to create unified control over the country, which is kind of the key question for my research on bounded democratization, is because you have to give up national control. But there are interesting problems here, right? Like in Indonesia, there's conflict between the national police and the military. And certainly I think there could be conflict there if things got really tense. But I think the main problem with trying to apply the police model to other cases is there's just not a unified national institution of the police, right? So maybe I could extend this work and look at instances where there is a national police, right? Because as I'm thinking about all these different cases where there's actually authoritarian rule where the incumbent autocratic doesn't use the military, they're actually using kind of their own internal police to manage that. So yeah, that's an interesting question.
Does it come down to then the question of you're really just looking at the kind of elite leadership of the military and the way that they are negotiating things at an institutional level, but you're not really looking at the military as a voting bloc or I mean, because in a place like Thailand, you know, or the US, you know, this idea that the military tends to vote for particular parties or supports particular parties plays in, but is different from what you've looked at.
Yeah, this is
right?
very the commanding officers, right? The people that can give the order for the tanks to roll into the street.
But the others there too. And so I guess I feel like that might be something that you'd want to work in some nuance about in terms of, you know, there is a way in which the top people or the leadership, you know, be it institutional or not, shapes, you know, that as a voting block.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think in future research, I definitely want to look at kind of the voting behavior, either lower ranking officers or NCOs, and see how they perceive democracy. I had this idea for a survey experiment to do in Indonesia. I just have to get money to do it, right? So.
Thank you, Darin. We have a few more questions in the chat. I'm also a little bit conscious about our time. We would need to have a hard stop at 2 p.m. So let's see how many questions we will be able to pick up. The next question was coming from Lisa. Lisa, let me know if you want to ask your question yourself or you want me just to read it.
Oh, hi, sure. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, thank you all so much. Darin, thank you so much for sharing this research. I'm amazed at how much you packed into 12 months of field research. So congratulations.
Yeah, it was a sprint the whole time.
That's great. That's great. Wonderful. So your discussion of the military and the importance of territorial integrity in Indonesia, for example, made me think about the Navy, the Indonesian Navy, and how important it is to maintaining that as well as the Army. So I'm wondering, have you started to unpack the military as disaggregate the military as an actor and look at variation among the branches of service to democratization and possibly the political parties? That's a big question, but it just seems very interesting to me. They may have different ideologies across the Army versus Navy, for example, in both countries or both cases.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. In fact, it's my next big project. So after I finish the dissertation and start the next book project that I want to work on, it's actually then turning the focus back towards kind of the internal characteristics of the military, right? So for the dissertation, I just kind of wanted to kind of package up the military to show how its relationship with a political party matters across these different cases. And eventually I want to be able to measure the institutional structure of the military and kind of interagency disputes, right? So within the Indonesia case, as you mentioned, like Navy versus Army is a big deal. But also in other authoritarian regimes, right? Like you have these incumbents that create these Praetorian guards, presidential guards, right? So we need to understand like how cohesive is the officer corps, right? Like I know lots of questions about this would be like, well, what about like the green versus red and white factions in the Indonesian military, right? So these are kind of things that I have to assume away for the sake of the simplicity of my model, but definitely things that I want to tackle in greater depth after the dissertation.
Okay, thank you and good luck.
Thanks.
Thank you, Darin. And I think we'll be able to pick up just one last question. And I apologize to Jeffrey for not addressing his comment. The last question is from Venta. Venta, let me know if you want to address it yourself.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm just wondering I'm sorry if I was mistaken to listen to your presentation. I just thought like, first of all, you said that Indonesia gained the independence in 1949, because I'm sorry if I was mistaken. That's what I heard, because what I know is that Indonesia gained the independence in 1945, but it's just a small thing. I don't know whether you have a reason of saying that if you said that 1949. But my questions are, so first of all, you talk about the social connections in Indonesia, the military and the people, and you compare that with Paraguay. I don't know anything about Paraguay, so I don't know how is it the comparison exactly. So I just listened to your presentation, which is, I find it very interesting. But how do you see the social connection in Indonesia between the military and the society? Because in Indonesia, they used to have the dui fungsi ABRI. I don't know whether you know that. So it's like the program where actually the military tried to engage the social life, and that's why it enables the military, whether retired or the military officer, to get the positions in the society, whether it's for the social work or whether it's official positions. And then secondly, with the COVID-19, now people talk and protesting whether it's going to be fascism or the role of the government getting stronger. Do you think that countries with a strong military influence will go farther away from the democracy? Because when something is indoctrinated, so it's like now with the COVID-19, you have to follow this procedure. And then with a strong military influence, do you think that there will be more move farther away from democracy because it enables the military to get in? Just like, for example, in the case of Indonesia, that we used to have a strong military influence, and until now we cannot get rid of it completely, sure. But with the COVID-19, do you think that there is more possibility that it would destroy the democracy which we're trying to build, or actually it doesn't matter compared to other countries with less strong military influence? Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So saying independence at 1949 is intentional on my part. I do know that it was declared in 1945, but I'm just going to kind of recognize when the Dutch are finally negotiate the exit, right? And that's just kind of to help non-Indonesianists kind of understand the foundation of the military there being built off of PETA, right? So in the job market paper, or in the paper in the dissertation, I go into more detail there, but you're certainly right about the contention there with 1945. And as for dui fungsi, and kind of like the social aspect of it here, I think in the case of Indonesia, it presents a significant challenge to get the military out of politics completely. And that's actually the second part of the dissertation. So the first half is like, does the military just step away from kind of controlling legislatures and the executive, right, directly, as we saw in the Orde Baru, and allow procedural democracy to happen, right, through these elections? And I'm trying to argue that the circumstances that were needed for the military to step away in 1998 were it needed parties there to defend it, and they weren't really there at first. And so it took reformasi to see like, okay, so Golkar is going to stick around, SBY wins this election, so the military can kind of step back. But since then, the military has just been active on the fringes. I don't see this as a threat for the military to completely re-enter politics, right? Like when I was in the field there, like there was the debate about neo dui fungsi, and the expanding political role of the military. I think that's where there's the most problems for Indonesian democracy, in terms of just military intrusion into what are traditional civilian affairs, right? Especially in bureaucratic politics. But I don't think the circumstances are there for the military to ever take, or in any time soon, to take full control like we saw in 1965, right? Like there was a pernicious, there was a direct threat against the military by the PKI. The party system was not friendly towards the military, and that's why we see the military build Golkar over the Orde Baru, and that's why it's kind of been out of that sphere of politics since. But as for COVID, I think and then one last note, I think if we want to be optimistic about Indonesia, I think we should look at the last two elections, where the fact that Prabowo was defeated and democracy actually survived in both those cases, like this minimal threshold of democracy, we should be kind of optimistic about that, right? Like Indonesia has gone through a severe test and survived those things. But yeah, where there's going to require more activity is going to be on containing the political influence of the military on the edges. And I just don't see that happening because the parties in Indonesia will not coordinate on those issues, right? They can't coordinate on military reforms. And then furthermore, the parties themselves are dependent upon the military for support, right? Like the parties use officer business networks for clientelism in elections, right? Officers retire and immediately go into high-ranking positions in these parties. And so, yeah, I think in the long term, that's going to stay the same, and potentially we'll see a little bit more of the military, especially seeing how Jokowi has kind of circled the generals around to manage the COVID crisis rather than really building civilian state capacity.
Thank you so much, Darin. Well, I think this was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody who was with us. Yeah, thank you for wonderful presentation, and looking forward to seeing everybody again next week, evening time, 8 p.m. East Coast time.
Yeah.
Thank you, Darin.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. It's good to see some familiar faces. And I hope everyone takes care.